Well, for more on this, particularly Russia's standing with Syria, let's speak with Edward Burke. He's a foreign policy fellow at the think tank, the Centre for European Reform in London. And he studied and worked in the area of foreign policy throughout the EU and in the Middle East, including Afghanistan. And Edward Burke joins me now from our London studio. Edward Burke, thanks very much for your time this evening.
A pleasure to be with you, Scott.
Now, the head of UN peacekeeping has said Syria is now in the grip of civil war. Both conflicting sides, they say, no, we're not. From what you've seen, what you know, is Syria indeed experiencing civil war?
Yes, I do think it is experiencing civil war. I think it's also experiencing an escalating sectarian conflict. And we're now looking at the regional dimensions creeping in with events in Lebanon, attacks there linked to allies of President Assad and also opponents of President Assad. So we're dealing in a highly regional context. The regional conflict has really kicked off. It's clear that Iran, Iraq, elements of the Lebanese government are backing the Syrian regime. On the other hand, we have Saudi Arabia and Qatar now arming insurgent groups, about which we know quite little, and some of whom may even be quite extremist. And have a sectarian bent. So it is, frankly, we're at a very, very dangerous point right now in the conflict. And dealing with that regional dimension is absolutely fundamental to reversing this the critical situation we have now.
Before we look further at that regional dimension, let's broaden it even further in terms of the international community doing more to bring about a resolution. A lot of blame is being sheeted home, at least by many in the West, to Russia. Why is Syria seen as so important to Russia?
Well, Russia, thinks in a very realist sense. It thinks about the simply how it wields power in the world, and it hates to back away from an ally. And Syria is its only ally in the Arab Mediterranean right now. It certainly doesn't want to set a precedent where it backs down. It's also quite angered about what it sees as the West over or abusing the UN resolution on Libya to enable it to militarily intervene in a way that was not, they believe, was not sanctioned by the UN Security Council. So Russia sees this as a critical test for their influence and how they treat their allies in the world. On the other hand, however, they do think that the writing is on the wall for the Assad regime in terms of the power status quo in Syria. So they do think that they needed political transition that enables them to maintain some influence in Syria, as opposed to the alternative, which is escalating chaos, whereby the region becomes more precarious and Russia's influence and power diminishes in the maelstrom.
Well, you've written a piece, an opinion piece for the New York Times, and it was entitled "Let Russia Lead the Way," a title that pretty much sums up your argument through it. Yet, as you point out in your argument, that the Kremlin's, and as you said a moment ago, the Kremlin's diplomatic efforts are almost entirely devoted to advancing Russia's power in the world. Why would anyone else in the international community, and indeed in the region, allow Russia to lead the way in this if that is what drives the Kremlin, what drives Moscow?
I think right now that Russia's influence in terms of looking after its power and its assets in Syria actually coincide with a sense of realism on their part, that they need to engage in a political dialogue with the opposition, that there has to be some change that allows elements of the regime to stay in place together with and a compromise with the opposition. I think they know that Western sanctions will actually eventually have a corrosive effect upon the regime. The regime cannot survive in the long term, but what they're concerned about is in the short to medium term, what happens to their influence in the country as it diminishes. So for them, it's not an altruistic or moral thing to do. It's simply that they feel that this is how this best secures their interest. And frankly, I think that we can use that in terms of a compromise between the government and the opposition is a good way to stop the escalation of this conflict, is a good way to limit the regional strategic implications for the West also. And I'm disappointed when I see that, for example, we are unable to talk to Iran about Syria. We talk to Iran about a lot of things, including its nuclear program. And Iran is actually a critical player in Syria. But it also needs to know what the bottom line is. It doesn't want to see its influence completely eroded in Syria. And it certainly doesn't want to see a sectarian takeover in Syria that harms its interests and harms its security and harms its allies in Lebanon, such as Hezbollah. So we need to play real Kissinger politics here. This is bringing together the outside powers who have refused to form an international contact group, as suggested by UN envoy Kofi Annan, which I find very disappointing. And it's playing real diplomacy. It's hard diplomacy. It's difficult. No optimum outcomes. You have to deal with very unsavoury people, but it may prevent worse violence, worse killings, a worse situation for the West.
So how likely, pursuing that argument, how likely is it that there will be an all-encompassing regional conference to avoid what you were talking about in that first answer about the whole region being on a precipice potentially here, and bringing in the entire region, all players, for some sort of conference on Syria?
Well, I'm a little bit disappointed, for example, that the West has decided that it is unable to talk to critical actors when it comes to Syria. We need to talk to all powerful regional powers here, not only Iran, Saudi Arabia also. We need to make sure that we have full involvement, because these are the guys who can actually bring to bear serious pressure upon the Assad regime. The Assad regime could not survive to this point without support from Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, etc. So if we get, if we manage to, at this point, frankly, those powers think that it's either they fight on or it's a disaster. There is no compromise on the table. There is no political plan on the table. So I'm disappointed, frankly, that the West doesn't see this realpolitik, as it is, and just get talking about a compromise solution. The West has refused to talk to Iran. I find that disappointing.
In terms of looking for a compromise solution within, it is almost, in the eyes of many, too late for that. How does one compromise with a regime that has purportedly and allegedly done as much and as horrific as what has been done by the Assad regime to its own people?
I agree. What has been done is horrific. It is. I cannot condemn it more, and there are many war crimes that will have to be dealt with over a long period of time. However, there are many other situations in the world where we had to come to initially quite uncomfortable compromises, because what we need right now is a way. Many who support the regime, and there are still many, believe that their backs are against the wall. Either they support the fight on against the insurgency, or, well, there's no guarantees for the future. They may well be massacred. I'm talking about the Alawite community, sections of the Christian community. And so these people have no guarantees whatsoever that in terms of a compromise that can be done. And it's this lack of attention to political detail by, for example, our diplomats in the West that I find troubling. For example, in South Africa, we had to make an allowance for the former regime. We had to say because frankly, they may have fought on. The Afrikaner-led security forces could have fought on for a very long time if it felt that it had committed a lot of crimes, but its backs were against the wall. It had no way out, and it had to keep on killing because there was no compromise. What has happened in Syria is awful, but we need to look at it as it really is in terms of we have to deal with justice over a long period. It's going to be difficult. We'll have to deal with reconciliation. But what we can't have is a situation whereby this escalating sectarian war, whereby certain communities feel that they have no options but to support the regime. There is no compromise of it on the table. And so I feel that, frankly, that won't come from within. The only way we can have a plan is for the regional backers, the regional actors who are supporting different sides in this conflict to come together, put a plan on the table and really push Assad, but also the opposition, to accept a compromise solution, because if we don't, the alternative is pretty awful, to be honest.
Edward, a moment ago we heard the sound grab from the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying that Russia is potentially escalating the conflict there by continuing to sell arms, including helicopter gunships, to Damascus. Why would Moscow persist in that line of sale, in that line of connection with the Assad regime at this time?
Frankly, Moscow is concerned that the regime will collapse quite quickly, and that chaos and a maelstrom of violence will ensue that leaves its influence nowhere, frankly. So it does know that the current power status quo is doomed in the long term, and that change has to happen. But it doesn't want to see it too quickly. It wants time to develop a diplomatic solution. I utterly find it immoral and, very, very regrettable that Russia decides to send these type of weapons to the regime, clearly because how they're using them. However, the longer we refuse to engage in this real diplomatic, difficult conversation with powers such as Russia, Iran, Iraq, well, frankly, we will see the continuation of this violence, and we will see Russia, unfortunately, will not neglect its ally. It will keep arming its ally. But in the same sense, Saudi Arabia and Qatar will also keep arming their allies. So, and we're looking at an escalating situation. Russia is concerned that these groups that are being armed by Gulf countries don't step into a position of power too quickly. It believes that they are arming some pretty dubious groups, and some of whom may even have jihadi militant extremist connections. So there's a lot of lack of confidence on all sides now in the international community. I think it's highly regrettable that Kofi Annan's proposal of 2 months ago to set up an international contact group wasn't actually supported by the West. The West has really, told Kofi Annan to go and negotiate a political transition, but given him very little assistance in terms of detail of what that would look like, in terms of what a real transition process looks like in Syria, because it is difficult and these details are uncomfortable. But we can't just keep condemning and refusing to face reality. And we need to face the diplomatic reality. We need to face the power reality in the region. We cannot simply condemn and dictate from the West. That's not how it works.
Edward Burke, there in London, talking to us from the Centre for European Reform. I thank you for your insights and your time with us this evening.
A pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.